I will start with the main question of the interview. I know you'll take this with a grain of salt because you have a great sense of humor. Could you please give me the phone number and the email address of Alexander Hammond?
Sure.
Your great friend.
Yeah.
I would like to do an interview with him. I'm joking.
No, and that's no problem. I mean, send me an email and I'll forward it to him.
Thank you so much. Well, this was meant to be a joke because you have a great sense of humor, as I said, and because we will be talking about very serious matters.
Okay.
And I thought maybe for a change we could approach this lightly, if we can.
Well, he's a very serious guy. He only has one flaw in his life, and that's because he supports Liverpool Football Club. You know?
Oh. Who are you cheering for? What's your favorite team?
But this is where I really do have a sense of humor. My favorite team is Stoke City.
Oh,
yeah, exactly. That's what everybody says. So I've been supporting them since I was 4 years old. My father was a professional goalkeeper, and so he used to take us across from Dublin to England to watch the best goalkeepers. And the best goalkeepers always played for Stoke: Gordon Banks and Peter Shilton. So that's how I became a Stoke fan.
That's great. So do you play football yourself?
I did, but not very well. Sasha is actually an attacker, and I'm a sort of defender. And we make jokes about how we're going to play against each other eventually in the Literary World Cup.
That's great. So we could think of a team of 11 players, all writers.
Sure.
And just assign their posts. So
no problem. That actually sounds like a good thing. There is actually there was a Writers' World Cup being introduced a few years ago, but it went by the wayside, unfortunately. Do you play?
Well, we're talking about this now before the UEFA Champions League, so it's the right time to be talking about it.
Yes.
Well, now, jokes aside, I'll start from the origins and from the very beginning, meaning with your name, which comes from Latin, from colomba, which is dove.
Yes.
So here we go, birds again. This seems to be a recurrent motif in your life. So I'm going to ask you, do you really believe in the power of words or of names? What's in a name? Everything, actually? And on a secondary note, do you really love birds that much?
Well, first of all, Colum is either a dove, as you say, or a pigeon. So I think I'm much more aligned with a pigeon than I am with a dove. Do I believe in names and character, the fate of a name? Yeah, I do, because I think so much is wrapped up in language and in the instinct of that language, and often, you know, so much of our fate is determined around how and where and we tell our stories about ourselves, and names, of course, are vastly important. As for birds, I have to tell you this. Before I started this novel, I would not have been able to identify. I'd been able to identify standard birds, robins and magpies and pigeons, but I didn't really know anything at all about ornithology. I stumbled upon it because it became. Well, I went to Beit Jala in the West Bank, and there I found that they had a bird ringing center, and I didn't know what a bird ringing center was. And then I found out that it was, where they banded the birds, and I thought it was such a spectacular image, because all these birds are coming from Ireland, from Romania, from South Africa, from Algeria, and they're all congregating on this point, and this bottleneck point, which is over Israel and Palestine, and it's so almost like we all meet there. We all have elements of the birds within us, and people were tagging them and identifying them, but the birds refused the idea that they should be identified, and this was really, really, really interesting to me. And the more I got into it, the more powerful it became, and I began to discover the world of the frigate birds, for instance, and then triggered all sorts of things in my mind, including, say, Francois Mitterrand's last meal, where he eats these tiny songbirds. And when I was in the bird ringing center doing my research, I went down with the Palestinian ornithologists, two of whom had been shot at just before walking around in various areas of their country. But we found a little tiny songbird enmeshed in the net, and it was an amazing thing.
Oh, so that's such a great metaphor, what you just said, which leads us to another great metaphor, to Apeirogon, the title of your book, which depicts a very, very serious matter, especially now when the war is at its peak again. I'm talking about the Israel and Palestine war for the few who haven't read the book, which is the story, a true story of Rami and Bassam, a Jew and a Palestinian who have lost their daughters in this awful war. What was your interest in writing this story, and how come Apeirogon, which is quite a metaphor, and I'll let you explain it to our readers.
Sure. An Apeirogon is a shape with a countably infinite number of sides. Mm-hmm. It's a crazy name for a book. Mm-hmm. My publishers were like, "Okay, you're going to write about Israel and Palestine?" Okay. And then he said, "You're going to call it Apeirogon?" Yeah. and a word that nobody knows, and I didn't know. I mean, it was a discovered word, but when I came upon it, I tucked it in my back pocket and I thought, what an amazing thing to have an infinitely sided shape. Mm-hmm. So it fit into my ideas about us all being complicit in this particular thing. And I went to Israel and Palestine with my non-profit group, Narrative 4, which is a story exchange group for young people. And I at the end of 2 weeks, I was there with these activists and artists, musicians, and I had an incredible couple of weeks. And we went to all sorts of different places. We met settlers, we met soldiers, we met Palestinian rap stars, we met imam and rabbis, and all sorts of camera angles, a kaleidoscopic series of camera angles on what was going on. But on the second to last day, go into this town, Beit Jala, which is just outside Jerusalem. It was rainy, it was cold, it was 4:00 in the afternoon. I wanted to go to the hotel and get a drink, to be honest with you. And I just walked into this office, and these two ordinary men were sitting there, cups of coffee out in front of them at the table. And within half an hour, my world was completely disrupted in a spectacular way by the nature of their stories, and it felt to me like they were saying it for the first time ever. But really, they told these stories already a couple of times to different groups that particular day, and I told them thousands of times in their lives. Rami's daughter was killed by a suicide or homicide bomber in Jerusalem in 1997, and Bassam's daughter was killed by a rubber bullet to the back of her head, shot by an Israeli border guard in 2007. And against all odds, and there are spectacular stories laced within all of this. Against all odds, the two of them have become friends, and they don't they're not corny or sentimental about any of this stuff. They don't say we have to like one another. They certainly say we don't have to love one another. But if you're gonna live beside one another or exist alongside one another, we have to know each other. And that sounds simple, but nothing is simple, especially true simplicity. Yeah. I was completely rocked by this notion, and got back to New York. I'm Irish, I live in New York, I'm a white male, middle-aged, whatever. I can't write that stuff. What right do I have to go into to Israel and Palestine? But I kept thinking of those birds and those, and everybody arriving in one form or another to Jerusalem. And I went to Rami and Bassam and said, "Okay, guys, can I write about you?" And they were like, "Yeah." I'm like, no, but you don't understand. I'm a novelist. You know, I make shit up. And they're like, okay. And then they said to me, look, the worst has been done to us. We've lost our daughters. If you can capture a modicum of that story, a modicum of what it is that we believe in, enough will have been done. And so they let me go. And I spent the next couple of years going back and forth to the West Bank, to Jerusalem, riding on Rami's motorbike, walking through checkpoints with Bassam, hanging out with their families, getting to know them. And then I wrote a novel, which sort of questions the idea of what's true, what's not true, you know, all of these things that are going on. We're living in the quote unquote post-truth moment, whatever that means. And it seemed to me that the Apeirogon was the right word with which to sort of capture the messiness and the confusion and the beautiful confusion that is around all of this.
Yeah, well, it's very true that truth is always a complicated matter. And especially if you come from a journalistic background, because you've done your research, and they say that the best writers are those who take history and the current events and put them into fiction and make them work. And that's what you did in Apeirogon. Have you followed the latest events in Jerusalem and in the West Bank? And if yes, what angers you the most and what touches you the most?
Oh, what angers me the most is the crude representation of the Palestinian people, as if, you know, everyone you know, has a keffiyeh, and everyone is marching down, you know, to throw rocks and stones, or launching you know, rockets indiscriminately, you know, whereas it's so much more nuanced than that. I'd love to take everybody there today, and we would walk together into Beit Sahur, for instance. Let's go to the Cafe Singer, which is on this little side street, cobbled side street in Beit Sahur, which is near Bethlehem. And you walk in there, and it's a cafe, and you get a really nice espresso. And there are young people there talking about philosophy, and there are people who are impeccably dressed, you know, and doing things on the internet, and designing things, and dreaming themselves so far away from the idea of Hamas that it's not even possible that they could even be in the same universe. There's all of that stuff going on. The incredible hospitality of the people that I met there. I would like some of this to seep out into the world, so that we could get a more complicated version of the truth, which, as you say, is so there's no one truth. Just like there's not two sides. There's so many more than two sides. And the same goes for Israel, by the way. You know, you go into Israel, they're not blindly following Netanyahu. And if I take any hope from any of this, in fact, there's a really interesting line from the Muwallaqat, which is a series of 6th century Arabic pre-Islamic poems. And one of these lines I love, it says, "Is there any hope that this desolation can bring us solace?" And on the days that it was happening, I thought, no, there is no hope. And especially if you're over there, there's no hope. How can you have solace when bombs are going off and kids are getting killed? But we have to dare eventually to, you know, find something within all that. And you know what's happening now, even in the United States, is that a lot of younger people, particularly you know, this younger generation, is beginning to talk about Palestine in a new and more profound and more embracing way. Which I love, and the nature of the debate is actually changing, and stories are coming like a flock of birds, sort of from underneath, emergent. And this theory of emergence is really interesting to me, because we like birds, we get cleverer the more we sort of work together. Like, stories are emergent things. Like, one bird is beautiful and does all these things, but a flock of birds can do all sorts of crazy mathematical, you know, agile things in relation to migration and memory and all these things. I believe that in terms of stories and storytelling, there will be a sense of emergence, and enough of this crap from the top down, from corporations and politicians and indeed artists, mea culpa, that something is gonna it's going to be a Greta moment, like Greta Thunberg. Something will come from underneath, and a new form of understanding will be engaged. It's kind of like what has happened or is happening with the Black Lives Matter movement over here. So much good stuff came out of such desolation.
Yeah, that's true. And what you said about hope and desolation made me think of ego and of suffering. It's like ego is at the center of the war. Sometimes ego is at the center of writing as well. But as Sade, the singer, sings that love is stronger than pride. Is suffering stronger than ego as to make wars stop? And what is the role ego plays for a writer, especially writing about such matters where ego is at the forefront? Yeah,
it's a brilliant question, and I'm so glad that you sang during our interview.
Thank you. You can join me if you want. We can sing together.
I'll just do something like "In Dublin's fair city."
I don't know the lyrics, but I can look them up.
But Sade is really good. Sade is really good. Ego, writers are monstrous with our egos, and it's two things. It's like we're sort of kept together. You have all this ego, and then you have to divest yourself of all the ego at the same time. It's like, Fitzgerald says, you've got to hold these contradictory ideas in the palm of your hands, and that becomes the essence of intelligence. Because, a writer believes that she or he, has something to say, that's driven by a form of ego. But there also has to be, on the same hand, a form of selflessness and humility that goes into all of this. That's where you surrender yourself to the process and you try to tell the story in as profound and beautiful a way as possible. There's a lot of talk, as you know, right now about cultural appropriation and people stepping into the territory of others. And I'm so happy that we're talking about it. And the people who brought this up in the universities and in our newspapers and so on, I think it's fantastic because they're right. There's been years of condescension, patronizing attitude, going in and plundering and coming out and being facile with other things. But at the exact same time and on the exact same hand, this goes to the notion of ego too. The best writers, the best thinkers, the best people, the best activists will go into another place and they'll bow their heads and they will say, I don't know. Please help me. I need to know. I want. This is a form of cultural celebration rather than appropriation. If you will teach me, I can go back to my own culture and sort of reinvigorate it in certain ways. And I think that's particularly important. So this notion of ego, clashing with egolessness is really a touchstone of our times. If you look at things like Twitter, it's all driven by ego. There's no sense of generosity. It's all like it's diseased with certainty. It's so certain of itself. But whereas the real truth comes about when you acknowledge how stupid you happen to be or how ignorant you happen to be in a generous way, like and that you want to go in and find out. And in the end, in writing this book, I don't think a Palestinian could have written it, and I don't think an Israeli could have written it. Because it's about these, and somebody had to come in from the outside, I think, and I happened to be lucky, and I listened, and I spent a lot of time listening to these men, and it's not some sort of like, the airy fairy sort of pie in the sky moment, kumbaya or anything like that. These guys are tough, and their belief in hope is so much more muscular than the ones who want to go out and fight, or the cynics who sit in the corner, and enjoying themselves. I mean, one of my things that I like to talk about a lot is how sentimental the cynics are.
Well, that's true. Yeah, the contraries attract, and you're right. They are tough, but at the same time, they are real. So most of the time, they're very real. What's also real is that your book is like a cabinet of curiosities.
Wow,
it's filled with minute details and anecdotes and the mundane and the curious. So you mentioned the episode with François Mitterrand eating the ortolan, his last meal, another bird, a very special bird. Also, I personally like very much the episode of Philippe Petit, another person who exists, the high rope walker. He walks between the Twin Towers of World Trade Center, but also on top of Jerusalem on the border. And he tried to release a dove, which wouldn't go. And he almost made him fall. And that's spectacular in itself, and also as a metaphor. How did you put together all these tiny pieces? Because your work is indeed a mixture of the epic and the tiny. And the tiny works for the epic more than the epic itself does, more than the core of the matter. It's like you're underlying everything in a very subtle way.
Well, thank you for saying that, and thank you for recognizing that. I mean, the local is the universal. When you think about it, the job of the writer is to be epic and tiny, sort of at the same time, and you only get at the epic when you investigate the supposedly anonymous corners of human experience. So you go into a room that's cleared of all its furniture. The cultural critics have taken the furniture. Journalists, including myself, I count myself as journalist. The journalists have taken out the furniture, and we've examined it, and philosophers have gone in, and so on. And the fiction writer is left with an empty room. What do you do? Well, if you're no good, you walk away and say the room's empty. But if you're really good, you go in and you sweep it up. And a little bit of dust, comes up in the air, and from that little speck of dust, you can recreate the whole history, the whole of that room again. And that seems to me to be part of the job, and the joy and the difficulty of fiction writing is to find that little spark. Poetry does it so beautifully. I mean, I have such respect for poets. I couldn't write a poem to save my life. Oh, Sasha Heyman, by the way, he's just written a great book of poetry. Did you read his new poems?
No.
Oh, they're good. They're so good.
I didn't even know he was writing poems, but
yeah,
that's
he's writing poems now. Yeah.
Thank you for letting me know.
I mean, he's a great friend. He's a great writer, and he's a great thinker. We disagree on a lot of things, including, of course, our football teams, as we said. But we do get into knock him down arguments about empathy and all this sort of thing, and he hates when I tell him that he's a sentimental old cynic.
Maybe he says the same about you, and I'm so glad you mentioned poetry, because this was my next question.
Oh, there you go.
I feel you're extremely poetic in your writing. Do you think this part of you, this streak of poetry, comes from your Irishness?
Yes. I mean, we're sort of tortuously poetic, aren't we, the Irish? I mean, but language matters so much, probably because our language was taken from us. And another language was foisted down upon us, and so we write in the language of those who oppressed us, and in many instances we wrote differently to them, and I would say wrote better than them. When you think of Joyce and Flann O'Brien and all sorts of people, including a lot of younger people, and especially a lot of young women in Ireland these days. And we're sort of really engaging on the level of language. So for me, I mean, that's all it comes down to. It's how you say it. I mean, plot doesn't matter. As far as I'm concerned, plot is juvenile. Who cares about plot? Character matters, yes, but you only get to character when you have the language to say it. So the original moment in the beginning was the word, and I think my engagement with poetry. I say I'm not a poet, and I'm not, but I read so much poetry, and sound is incredibly important to me. So when I write my books, I read them aloud. I walk around the house, and my son goes, "Oh Jesus, there goes Daddy saying the F word again," or whatever, But I want to read it aloud because I want it to sound out and for it to feel. I don't know, that we've got to be in the pulse of the moment. We really do.
Well, since you mentioned poetry, I'm thinking of "Do not go gentle into that good night." Is that a spirit you embrace? Because you've been a journalist, you lived in Texas, you traveled across the US by bicycle, you lived in Japan. It's quite adventurous as a life. It's not gentle at all towards yourself. It's like you would want to live everything and absorb everything. And is that your spirit? Do not go gentle into that good night.
Rage against the dying of the light. Yeah, and that's particularly poignant that you picked that out. My father, who passed away 6 years ago, but when we were young, at Christmas time, used to play on the record player. Used to play Under Milk Wood, and also Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales, and as it was narrated, and we would sit around and listen to the record player, and then I do remember when my father died, thinking about rage against the dying of the light, and I do think that you have to live your life out loud. I was very lucky to be able to take off at a young age and do go on these adventures. I walked across Ireland a couple of times. I took a bicycle across the United States. Most of my adventures now are in the head, unfortunately. I mean, I really like to do something crazy, like, I'm dreaming of walking from down the Chilean coast to Patagonia. And maybe someday I should do it. I'm 56 now, and it's it's time to go on another adventure. I feel, but I do also believe that everyone should do at least one thing in their life that doesn't compute. Something that people scratch their heads and say, "What the hell? What's she doing? She's joining the army, or she's working for this World Peace Organization, or she's writing a poem, or whatever." But we all should do at least one major thing in our lives that disrupts the conventional idea that people have about us, and because that becomes the story. That becomes the story of what you want to tell at the end of it all.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's so true. So conventional is a word one cannot use in order to describe your novels. And since you mentioned this moving all throughout your life, Transatlantic, a novel which is going to be published soon at the same publishing house, Litera, which publishes Apeirogon, is about searching for your roots while going transatlantic.
Right.
Like, how was this experience for you? You're an Irishman in New York, and you've been wandering for your whole life. What was it to write about this, and what was the sense of place you had in mind when you wrote Transatlantic?
Oh, well, Transatlantic, it takes three primary stories, sort of quote unquote real, what we would call real stories. First one being about Frederick Douglass, the American activist who was still a slave in the 1840s when he visited Ireland and went on a speaking tour. It's an amazing story that this 27-year-old man arrives in Ireland. He's very elegant and he's taken around by the wealthy Anglo-Irish. At the same time, the Irish famine is unfolding at his feet, and he has this he has this terrible dilemma about what he should or should not say about what's going on during the famine, because he has to look after his own people back home. It's 3 million people enslaved back home in the United States. So that was a story that's one of the stories. The second story is about the first transatlantic flight, where these two British RAF fighters, just out of the war, decide to take the war out of the plane and instead to bring it from Newfoundland, Canada, to Ireland. They did it amazingly without a gyroscope. And anybody who knows anything about planes will be shocked to hear that the first transatlantic flight in 1918 was done without a gyroscope. So there's that story, the Frederick Douglass, and finally then the story also of Senator George Mitchell, who goes transatlantically to try to negotiate the Irish peace process, which to me was the great story of the end of the 20th century in Ireland, if not all the way around the world. And it was also the story that sort of compelled me to look at Israel and Palestine too, because I got to know George Mitchell, and we had our peace process, and we had our Good Friday Agreement, and it's still shaky, but it's still there. It's still shaky in Northern Ireland, but it's there. And I talked to Senator Mitchell, who later was sent as special envoy to the United States to the Middle East, and he said to me, Colin, he said, you know what, Ireland was complicated. And it had many different sides, but you should go to the Middle East. If you think Ireland was difficult to understand, go to the Middle East. And eventually, he didn't do what he wanted to do under the Obama administration, and the process failed. But it was one of the things that sort of and these books sort of knock into one another, I suppose. Eventually, I'll understand, the arc of my career. I've written 10 books right now, and it's, often they move into one another. I'm trying to write something right now, but I've abandoned 2 books in the past year. I'm sort of thinking of another one, but I'm sure eventually I'll be able to see the links that come between these things. But I'm so delighted that, and I'm honoured to get a translation, and I want to thank everybody at the publishing house, because this, it's a big deal to get your work done in another language, and hopefully I can get across, and I know there's some festivals in Romania that I've been talking about going to. So maybe within the next year or so, it would be wonderful to get across and spend some time there, and because part of the world, I don't know, there's a kinship with Ireland. Am I right?
I suppose so. I mean, there should be one, and we are eagerly awaiting for you to come and visit us, and that's a lovely idea. So now that the travel can be resumed, it's like you can come. So I was thinking while you were talking about this, that all of your books are like jigsaws. So you search for the right piece to fill in, to put the puzzle, the jigsaw in order. And I was thinking of Apeirogon with 1,001 chapters, some of them extremely tiny, just one sentence. The Arabian Nights were a source of inspiration, or not only at the level of the form. Did they inspire you as a child or as a budding writer? What were your sources of inspiration in terms of books when you started to write? Is this one of them? How it's linked to the world you're depicting?
Well, as a child, I wasn't interested in the Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights. The reason I used that as part of the structure was when I was listening to Rami and Bassam, I realized that they were telling the stories in order to keep their daughters alive. And that was a Scheherazade moment. And I was like, oh, wow. And I knew that the novel was going to have to be fractured and to complicate things. And, wanted to in certain ways, to ape some of the things that were going on the internet, the way we make these leaps from one thing to the other. But when it came to putting 1001 fragments together, or cantos, I call them, it's difficult. It's like music. It's like holding all these different things in the air at the same time, but ultimately always going back to the story of the two girls, and that was important to me. That they were keeping the girls alive. And I needed to keep the girls alive in these different fragments. But as for knowing much about the 1001 Nights, I didn't really. And then I started to study Borges and his relationship with 1001 Nights and the Aleph and all of these things. I began to discover as I was writing this book about all of these things. But for me as a child in Ireland, in fact, Dylan Thomas would have been one of the influences, and of course my teachers, who were really, really, really amazing. But I will say that at the age of about 12, I suppose, I got really corralled by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And he's a sound poet, and he has that whole theory of the inscape of language, and it's beautiful. Like I saw this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dolphin, dappled dawn, drawn falcon, and the music of it was particularly important to me, and there was always music in our house. I'm not a musician whatsoever. But I am fond of, great music. In fact, this is sort of off the topic of the question, but I hope everybody can go and listen to an Irish musician by the name of Colum McCann. He wrote an album called And Now the Weather. And that's the album I listened to over and over and over again while I was writing Apeirogon. And then Colum, who was in a band called The Frames with Glenn Hansard and so on, he's one of the great fiddle players in the world. He came to the West Bank and to Israel with me just last year. No, not last year, the year before last. Last year disappeared. It's like November 2019 he came, and he played in the Singer Cafe, that cafe that I mentioned to you earlier. He played on the rooftop, and it was one of the most gorgeous moments of any of my excuse me, one of the most gorgeous moments of any of my travels to that part of the world. And then we went to a place, a house, an art colony called Dar Jasser, which has recently just been ransacked by the Israeli army. It's horrible what happened to it. But in the garden of the art colony, which is right by the wall, there were dozens of tear gas canisters and bullets and things like that, because it's right near one of the refugee camps. So Colum and I are in the garden together, and we're going through we're helping Emily Jasser, this artist, incredible Palestinian artist, to clean up the garden. And Colum picks up the tear gas canisters and starts to rattle them together, and then he taped it, and now he's making an album based on the novel, or based on inspired songs inspired by Apeirogon. And one of those songs is going to have the sound of these tear gas canisters sort of rattling together. It's and anybody who's interested in music should check him out. He's one of my best friends, but he's also just an incredibly talented musician. And you get inspiration from all sorts of places, but in particular, as you know, we sort of get inspiration from those places where it's raw and dangerous.
well, art is raw and dangerous and a source of inspiration for you and at the core of your writing. And I cannot stop, not carry on without mentioning Brâncuș. You mentioned Borges, but also Brâncuș is present in Apeirogon with his birds, and the famous incident of him being stopped by the customs when he entered the US with the two birds, and they thought they were mechanical artifacts and not art. This could not possibly be art. This is not art. It has a function. So what is the function of art in your writing?
Oh, you know what? I've been thinking about this, about form a lot recently. And Samuel Beckett said that the job of the artist now is to find a form that accommodates the mess.
Yeah.
And I love this notion. I love this notion. How do we find a form that accommodates and even confronts the mess? Because part of the problem is people don't want it to be messy. We talked earlier about everybody being certain. I'm certain of myself, and you can only come into my room if you agree with me. Preferably, you're going to look like me, and you're going to sound like me, and so on. And the world is becoming increasingly atomized by these opinions that have no length or breadth to them. But it seems to me that the real job of the artist now is to accommodate the mess, sing the mess, because it's so much better when it is messy, when it's complicated. Now, anybody who reads Apeirogon will scratch their head for the first 25 pages and say, what the hell is this? There's a bird here, there's a weapon here, there's a young girl walking down the street here, there's a guy on a motorbike, there's all of this stuff is going on. What is this? And really, what I was trying to say to the reader is, try to whisper, like Michael Ondaatje does beautifully in The Skin of a Lion. Whisper, there is order here. It's faint and it's human. Trust me. Come along with me, and this will make sense. And people don't care as much as they used to about the writer in society, and I'm perfectly happy with that. It's not something that bothers me. So the writer, she or he, has to work now out of an inner recklessness. If you really want to do something, and I suppose it was reckless of me to start talking about Israel and Palestine, because inevitably you get attacked in certain ways, and people say, you're sentimental, or you're colonial, or one person's going to say this is right, and the other person will say that exact same thing is wrong, and so on. But you've got to risk a certain amount of humiliation. You've also got to risk sentiment, not sentimentality, but sentiment. And be as brave as possible when you go in and kick down a couple of doors. But mostly, Bassam says a line from Rumi. Yesterday I was clever and I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise and I've learned to change myself. And that's really interesting. By the way, those two guys, maybe we'll get them there at some stage. They do travel the world. I don't think they've ever been to Romania, but maybe it's time for them to go. It would be amazing to be on stage with them and have them tell their stories, because for anybody who hasn't read the book, it's Bassam's story alone is incredible. He's 70. He's Palestinian. He's Muslim. He's 17 years old, and along with a group of friends, they find these sort of dud grenades in an old cave. They throw one of the dud grenades under an Israeli jeep, and it sort of fizzles out. He's lookout. He has polio, and he's lookout. And who gives the job of the lookout to the guy who can't run? Come on, you can't. Anyway, it gets serious. He gets caught. He gets 7 years in prison. He becomes commander of the Fatah unit in prison. He sees that there's going to be a documentary on the television, on Israeli television, about the Holocaust, and he wants to watch it because he wants to watch Jews die. He says this. I want to see them die. But then when he watched it, his world got disrupted, and he's like, but why are they not fighting back? What is going on? How can I understand this? And he changes, and he begins to think about and study notions of peace. He studies Gandhi, and he studies Martin Luther King, and he reads, and he comes out of prison, and along with other Palestinian activists and Israeli activists, they form an organization called Combatants for Peace. He gets married. He starts this peace organization. That's a big deal. Like, you know, to us, like certainly me, so sort of in Western Europe, whatever. Oh, peace activists. Oh, great. You know, anyone can do that. No, it was a really dangerous thing to do, an extremely dangerous thing to do, both in Palestine and in Israel. Anyway, he starts this peace organization, and 2 years after he starts it, his daughter gets a bullet in the back of the head. I mean, who can write this stuff? You know, only reality can write this stuff. You know, if I'd invented this, people would say, no, that couldn't have happened. And then he meets Rami's son, and then he and Rami become brothers. I mean, they are brothers. They put their heads on one another's shoulders, and they travel the world, and they're fierce. They're fiercely engaged. You know, they endure riots in Israeli schools. Parents go to the school gates and want to fight because the quote unquote terrorist is going in to talk about peace and peaceful engagement. And so it's kind of a wild story. And you know, I feel so lucky that they invited me in to discover it.
I suppose they were very pleased with the result and with the book. And I do love this idea of peace being a fierce thing and peace being bold. And your writing is bold, and Apeirogon is a bold novel. But since fortune favors the bold and the brave, why not? We'll be waiting for you here, all three of you. That would be quite something to listen to you and to the story unfolding under our very eyes, told by you and them.
Yeah, I mean, they were so good to me. I mean, honestly, you know, they just sort of took me under their wing, and we have become friends. But I didn't sugarcoat, you know, this stuff. I mean, and people might ask you why it's a novel when, you know, it really could have been a sort of a non-fiction account. But really, what I wanted to do was get into the heads of these guys and get into the hearts of these guys. I mean, I did one thing that, say, Bassam was a little bit upset by. But he understood it, and this is how crazy brilliant this man is. So when Bassam was in prison, he went on hunger strike for 17 days, right? Now, I've written about hunger strike in Northern Ireland before and so on, and I know what a hunger strike is. But you know, I didn't just want to say he finished the hunger strike after 17 days. I wanted somehow the reader to feel this. So in the narrative, I have him go down to the prison warden, and the prison warden has these like wrapped sweets, candies on the table, and Bassam reaches forward and takes one, and then he goes back to his cell and he slips the sweet into his mouth, and sort of breaking the hunger strike. The fact of the matter is that this didn't happen. But I wanted the reader to feel the hunger strike, and I wanted the line: the taste of the mint was the taste of the sweet was alarmingly minty, because I wanted people to sort of like to be jolted, you know, into the truth. It's like Rami's motorbike. Rami's motorbike in reality is an automatic. In the book, it's got gears, because I want to jolt the reader. I want to use the word clutch. I want to use the word gear. I want to use rev. I mean, all of these different words, so that the reader feels that they're on the motorbike, to be once again in the pulse of the moment. That's particularly important to me. So they allowed me to change certain things, but both of them will say that the book is entirely honest to their experience, and that was something that I was very I'm very grateful for, they just they opened themselves up. They told me stuff like they told me stuff that they'd never even told anybody else before. Like stuff like Rami talked about killing people in the 6 Day War, and shooting, and that's tough thing to talk about. And also then the way Rami tries to tell his son not to join the military, not to take on the conscription, all of these things. These are intimate moments, and how in the world that they read it. Like, for example, Rami reading about himself walking into the morgue, and the slide of the rollers on the cold metal tray. It takes some bravery to be able to live that and relive that. But I think the larger purpose and the reason they allowed me to do this was precisely because they felt that any form of any slice of truth that I could get, and that we could communicate some of the message to people would be very important. And that the occupation, they both talk about how wrong the occupation happens to be, and so this is not some sort of like balanced narrative, quote unquote. Even though it seems to be balanced, there's one side, 500 stories in the first half, 500 stories in the second half, and one in the middle, making 1,001. It's a narrative that says we need to understand it. It doesn't talk about one state. I mean, I couldn't tell you about one state, 2 states, 8 states, federation, confederation, any of that stuff. I don't know the answer. There are people a lot smarter than me who should answer that question. But what I do know is about the territory of the human heart, and what Rami's heart is like, and what Bassam's heart is like, and that's what I wanted to write about, I suppose.
Well, it's quite a feat because you made reality work in fiction. Taken as such, I mean, the core of the book, that part in which you give the floor to them, and that's very rare, because usually if you take reality as it is and put it in fiction, it doesn't work. You have to bend it a bit, and maybe poetry is the filter to do that.
Right. That's nice. Yeah. I think so. Poetry, sound, because ultimately what you want to do is make people feel. You don't want to tell anybody anything. Writers being didactic, there's nothing worse. I mean, like artists who tell you what to think. But if an artist allows you space to outthink the narrative that is presented there, that's even better. I mean, when my books get clever when people like you come along and interpret it and extend the narrative into the distance, into an Apeirogon, once again. I mean, so your readers are the ones who actually complete the book, and I'm not being disingenuous here when I say that people give credit to writers for being for being too intelligent. Most writers are not as intelligent as we think them to be. Really, that what they're doing is they're reacting on a gut emotional level. All of those ones who want to tell you, who have their themes, neatly laid out and so on. They're generally the ones who write poor prose. It's the ones who really sort of like, I don't know, adventure themselves into the work, who really discover something about the human spirit. But ultimately, it's not about the writer; it's about the reader. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, and also Shakespeare himself didn't know everything he put into his works. So there's space there, and it's okay to be so. You mentioned the word beauty several times, and that's a core thing for me. That beauty might save the world, in opposition to the truth. The truth is kind of sterile, while beauty is morphing into many, many forms, as you said. Do you think beauty can save the world? Is it enough? Could it be enough if used properly?
Yeah, I don't know what will save the world, but we certainly won't save the world if we don't have beauty. Mm-hmm. I don't know if beauty itself can save the world, because it can be a pretty nasty, dark place, and we have to acknowledge that the darkness and the really terrible things that we do and say to one another. But without the presence of beauty, then we're really in trouble. And so much of the beauty comes from stories and storytelling, and personal stories, the smaller stories, not the big ideas. Because look, facts can be used in all sorts of ways to shape a conflict. A Palestinian and an Israeli could use the exact same fact in completely different ways, or an Irish person could use a fact in completely different ways to bolster an argument. But nobody can make the human heart, all these issues of love, pride, pity, beauty, intelligence, sacrifice, all of those things, they're more nebulous. They can't be negotiated by facts, and that's where the artist gets in, tries to discover what's beautiful and what's ugly, and in the hope that people can save the world, and stories. We're knit together more with stories than anything else. And part of the beauty is that it'll never be perfect. Part of the beauty is that you have all this shit going on around you, and you have to negotiate it. It'll never be ultimately solved or saved, but you have to try to do it anyway. I suppose that's part of what I'm thinking.
Oh, but that's a great answer. So I have two short questions left. Actually, I have very many, but we're running out of time. Actually, we ran out of time, but I kept you going because you're fascinating. So I'm abusing you. So one is, which would be a book or a masterpiece in which you would like to live for a day? Oh. Not one of your books, obviously, in which you are immersed while writing it.
Oh, definitely Ulysses. I mean, it has to be Ulysses. June 16th, 1904. I'd I'd hang with my grandfather and my great-grandfather, and I'd go into the pub and walk around Sandymount, and and I'd meet Molly, and I mean, it's a vast compendium of human experiences, and it's one of the great novels of our times, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So you celebrate Bloomsday?
You bet. It's a thinking man's Paddy's Day.
Okay. Okay, so one last question. I read in one of your interviews that you're kind of frustrated when you give interviews, but being a journalist yourself, that you never get to ask a question or many questions. So is there a question you would like to ask me, not to put me in the spotlight, but just to give you the opportunity to be a journalist as well in this interview?
I love doing that. I mean, whenever I do interviews, I sort of often end up asking more questions. But your questions have been so good that I haven't even had a chance to question you. But what poem do you know off by heart, and what sort of poem sort of legislated your life? Is there one in particular?
Well, yes, I couldn't recite it now because I would have to think about it thoroughly because my memory is kind of failing me. But there are many authors. For instance, T.S. Eliot, Samuel Beckett. Well, The Wasteland. Right. And you know what? Every time in spring, I keep thinking that April is the cruelest month.
Right, right. We are
lilac is my favorite flower, one of my favorite flowers. And whenever I come across it, I think of this: April is the cruelest month. And indeed it is.
Right.
So Samuel Beckett, I love him a lot. Yeah, he's one of my heroes as well. And I have Romanian poets as well. Maybe you've heard of them. Well, of course, Eminescu is the national poet. There are several of his poems which I really, really love. Some of them not that known. Nikita Stănescu as well. I love Rilke also, Rainer Maria Rilke. Poetry is quite difficult to grasp because, on the contrary to the popular belief, you have to read it very slowly in homeopathic doses. Like one poem a day, or even few lines, just to let them stick. So, yeah,
that's great. And just in relation to the wasteland, I mean, I suppose we can finish off by saying, we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. And my favorite line is, sightless unless the eyes reappear as the perpetual star.
Yeah.
Such great stuff. I mean, and that's what it's all about. We're going to be sightless. We're going to be blind unless we sort of change the way we're looking at things. So I think literature does that in so many ways. So, and I deeply appreciate this interview and your questions. And I hope that I get across to Romania at some stage, whether sooner or later, it'll happen.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for this last line, the perpetual star of fiction and of poetry, let it shine upon us. Also, I didn't mention Yeats, but that would be for the golden apples of the sun and the silver apples of the moon. That would be for another debate about Angus.
That sounds
Thank
perfect.
you so much, Colum McCann.
Thank you.
A început Bookflix. Hai pe litera.ro la târgul de carte ce-ți aduce reduceri de până la 70%, bestseller cadou și evenimente cu autori de top. Toate surprizele adunate au loc în exclusivitate pe litera.ro.